Get ready, because today we're going deep on something epic, rock and roll. But, a lot of people hear rock and roll and they think like leather jackets, crazy guitar solos, huge stadiums full of screaming fans. But today, we're going way deeper.
All right, I'm ready.
Think of it like a musical archaeology dig. We're going to uncover how this music we know and love became a cultural force.
Love it.
And our guide for this dig is this report called Roots and Revolution, the evolution of rock and roll. And it's got some seriously cool stuff in it.
I mean, you're right. Rock and roll's story, it's not just about the music, like a mirror of all the social and cultural changes that were happening at the time. What's really fascinating is how rock came from this mix of so many different genres.
Okay, so let's talk about that mix. We're starting way before the electric guitars and the stadium crowds. So what were those early musical seeds? What's going on back then?
Well, you can't talk about rock and roll without the blues. It's like the emotional blueprint for rock. That raw expression, the stories about hardship and resilience, that's all blues.
But how did we get from those kind of melancholic blues tunes to this like rebellious music? It's a big jump. Was it just about slapping a backbeat on those blues melodies, or is there more to it?
No, it's way more than that. I think the blues had this raw emotional intensity, this like authenticity that people connected with. But then you had artists like Ray Charles and Little Richard, and they took those blues roots and like injected them with energy. Rhythm and blues, or R&B, took those stories from the blues and made them something you could dance to.
So same emotional core, different energy level.
Exactly.
Okay, but I'm guessing there are even more ingredients in this rock and roll recipe.
Oh yeah, for sure. You also have country and western, with its storytelling and relatable experiences. Like Hank Williams pouring his heart out in "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry," or Johnny Cash singing about love loss and life on the edge.
I could hear that.
That narrative element, that connection to everyday life, that was key for rock and roll.
You know, it's funny. I don't think a lot of people would connect country music to rock and roll. But when you think about it, those stories, those experiences, they're definitely there.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the lyrics, the instruments and arrangements also played a role. There's another genre that's super important, but people forget about it. Gospel music.
Okay, now that's interesting. Thinking big gospel choirs. So how does that fit into rock and roll?
Think about the power of those gospel vocals, harmonies and the emotion those singers had. And we can't talk about gospel without talking about Sister Rosetta Tharpe.
Oh yeah, I've heard that name. She was a real trailblazer.
Sister Rosetta Tharpe was an amazing singer, but also an amazing guitarist. She was playing electric guitar way before it was common in gospel music. Her performances were electrifying. She was one of the first to mix that spiritual feeling with a rocking sound. And her influence on early rock, especially someone like Chuck Berry, is huge.
So we've got blues, R&B, country, gospel. Anything else we need to add to the mix?
Well, don't forget those rhythms from Boogie Woogie and Swing. The piano of Meade Lux Lewis and Boogie Woogie, or the western swing of Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys. That high-energy, danceable vibe that led to things like rockabilly.
Okay, so we've got all these pieces. Blues, R&B, country, gospel, boogie woogie, swing. It's like rock and roll was meant to be with all of that going on.
It was brewing.
But now I want to talk about the people behind the music. Who are the artists that made this new sound come to life?
That's where our deep dive goes next. We're going to meet the stars and the unsung heroes who created rock and roll.
Because everyone knows Elvis and Chuck Berry. It's like a musical treasure hunt.
Exactly. We're going to find some amazing stories and learn about the people who built rock and roll.
So let's get into those stories. Who are these pioneers and where do they come from?
To understand that, we got to take a musical road trip. We're going to visit the birthplaces, the cities where it all started.
I love a good road trip. Where are we going first?
Okay, so we know rock and roll was brewing in this mix of genres. But how did this music go from these little pockets to like exploding onto the national stage? We got to look at some specific places.
Okay, so like these cities were important.
Yeah, it's like these cities were incubators for rock's early development.
Okay, so we're hitting some musical landmarks on our road trip.
Well, we got to start in Memphis, Tennessee. No rock and roll road trip would be complete without Memphis. This city was a musical melting pot, and at the heart of it was Sun Studios. Think of it as a musical laboratory where some of the biggest names in early rock and roll got their start.
I'm talking Elvis, Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis. They recorded some seriously iconic tracks in that place.
Tracks that changed music history.
What was it about Memphis that made it so special for this new sound?
Memphis was a crossroads, a place where blues country and gospel all came together. You had musicians coming from all over the South to Memphis, bringing their own styles and influences.
So like a musical melting pot.
And Sun's studio, with its open-door policy and willingness to experiment it, was the perfect place for those sounds to mix and evolve.
So it wasn't just about the talent. It was about the place, the atmosphere, the whole vibe of Memphis. But I'm guessing Memphis wasn't the only city cooking up this new sound.
Oh, definitely not. Our next stop is New Orleans, Louisiana, a city with a musical legacy all its own. New Orleans had this incredible mix of cultures and musical traditions. Jazz, blues, R&B, it was all there. That unique mix led to some really innovative artists.
I can already hear those New Orleans rhythms in my head. Who are we talking about?
You can't talk about New Orleans rock and roll without Fats Domino.
Oh yeah, Fats Domino.
His piano hits with those rhythms and good time vibes, they brought that New Orleans flavor to everyone. And then there's Professor Longhair, a master of New Orleans piano who influenced tons of musicians.
I love that we're digging into some of these lesser-known names, too.
Professor Longhair is a great example.
It shows how much depth there is to rock and roll's history. Okay, but we're on a road trip, so where to next?
Let's head north to Chicago, Illinois. While New Orleans had jazz and R&B, Chicago was all about electric blues.
Chicago blues. Now we're talking serious grit and raw power.
Chicago was where artists like Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf took blues to a new level.
Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, those were big names.
Yeah, they were giants.
It's amazing to think how all those regional sounds from New Orleans to Chicago were coming together to create rock and roll. But there's still a piece missing. How did this music that was in these specific cities become a national thing?
That's where our last stop takes us, Cleveland, Ohio. It might not seem like an obvious music city, but Cleveland was really important for connecting those regional sounds with the rest of the country. The guy who did that was DJ Alan Freed.
Alan Freed. Now, there's a name I know. I've heard he's the one who actually came up with the term rock and roll.
You heard right, Alan Freed was a visionary. He recognized the power of this new music from places like Memphis, New Orleans, and Chicago. And he started playing it on his radio show in Cleveland. He saw how this music was bringing black and white audiences together.
That's huge.
It was something special.
So he was more than just a DJ. He was like a cultural tastemaker.
Yeah, he saw how rock and roll could change things. He embraced the music, promoted the artists, and most importantly, he gave it a name, rock and roll. He organized concerts that brought these musicians to way more people, and he helped to start a national conversation about this new sound.
It's amazing how one DJ could have that much impact.
It's pretty incredible.
It shows that sometimes it takes one person with a vision to get a revolution started.
And speaking of revolution, the 1960s were about to take rock and roll to a whole new level. This is where it goes global.
The music scene is exploding, the world is changing, and rock and roll is right in the middle of it. Where do we even begin with all of that?
Well, I think the best way to understand the 1960s is to look at how rock and roll itself changed. It wasn't just one sound anymore, it was branching out in all these different directions. It was reflecting all these new voices and perspectives that were coming out.
I love it. I'm ready to hear all those different sounds. Yeah. Let's dive into the 1960s. Man, the 1960s were wild.
It was a crazy decade.
Rock and roll became this global thing, the soundtrack, for a whole generation dealing with so much change.
It's really amazing how music can reflect what's happening in the world. Rock evolved into so many forms in the 60s, each one capturing something unique about that time.
Okay, so let's break down some of those changes. You mentioned the British invasion. Talk about that.
Oh yeah, the British invasion was huge. It was like a tidal wave that hit America and the rest of the world. Bands like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and they weren't just playing music. They were like this new attitude, this feeling of freedom and rebellion that young people connected with.
I've always been fascinated by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. They're both British invasion, but so different. The Beatles had those catchy melodies and a clean-cut image. They were like the safe rebels. But then you have the Rolling Stones. They were raw and bluesy and just edgy.
Totally different vibe. It's a great point. They were two sides of the same coin, both challenging the rules, but in their own way. The Beatles brought optimism and possibility. Stones were darker, more rebellious.
And then you have The Who. So much energy. Their songs were anthems. It's like they were a bridge between pop and something heavier.
Totally. They were pioneers of arena rock, pushing the limits of live shows, creating this raw experience that people had never seen before.
But the 60s wasn't just about British bands coming to America. There was so much happening here, too.
Absolutely. American music was changing in really cool ways.
Like what?
Well, you had the rise of psychedelic rock. This genre was all about mind-altering experiences and spiritual exploration.
Psychedelic rock. I can already hear those guitars and trippy lyrics.
It's a unique sound.
Who are some of the big names in that scene?
You can't talk about psychedelic rock without Jimi Hendrix. He was a guitar genius pushing the limits of what you could do with the instrument, creating these soundscapes that were experimental and emotional.
He was a true innovator.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't just him.
You had Jefferson Airplane capturing the San Francisco sound. Their lyrics were all about freedom and social consciousness. And then there's Pink Floyd. They created these epic sonic journeys that took you to another world.
I've always thought Pink Floyd's music sounds timeless. It's like they were channeling something beyond the 60s.
I think they were tapping into universal themes. Alienation, longing, the search for meaning. Their music went beyond genres and time. Okay, so we've got British invasion, psychedelic rock. What else was big in the 60s? While all that was happening, another force was gaining momentum. Motown and soul.
Motown. We can't forget about Motown. It wasn't exactly rock and roll, but it had a huge impact on music and on society.
Motown was more than just a record label. It was a cultural phenomenon. Artists like Marvin Gaye, the Supremes, Stevie Wonder, they were making music that was catchy and soulful. They were talking about love, heartbreak, the fight for equality. Their music broke down racial barriers and shaped pop music for years to come.
It's amazing how Motown could have those catchy pop hooks and still have those deep messages about social change.
They did it so well. And speaking of music, with a message we can't forget about folk rock.
Folk rock. That's where the protest music comes in, right?
Artists like Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and the Byrds mixed folk music with rock. They created anthems about the political and social changes happening at the time.
Bob Dylan is a legend, a true poet, a voice of his generation.
His songs captured the feeling of protest and the desire for a better world. He was amazing with words, and his lyrics connected with people who were looking for meaning.
Yeah, people were searching for answers.
So we've got the British invasion, psychedelic rock, Motown, folk rock.
It's like a musical explosion all happening in the 60s.
It really was a time of change for music.
And it's hard to imagine rock and roll as we know it without the 60s.
It was that important.
It's mind-blowing how much happened in just 10 years.
It's a lot to take in.
We've been talking about these big names and movements, but I'm guessing there were tons of lesser-known artists who were also important.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The 60s were full of musical innovation.
So it wasn't just the famous people.
No way. There were so many bands and artists experimenting with new sounds, mixing genres, creating music that was both challenging and inspiring.
Okay, tell me more. Who are some of these hidden gems?
There's the Beach Boys. Most people think of them as surf rock.
Yeah, California Sunshine.
Exactly, but they were so much more than that. Albums like Pet Sounds were groundbreaking, pushing the limits of studio production.
Pet Sounds is supposed to be incredible. Crazy how they turned those simple pop melodies into something so complex.
They were ahead of their time.
And speaking of pushing boundaries, we can't forget the Velvet Underground.
Oh, yeah. They were definitely ahead of their time. Led by Lou Reed, they created this dark avant-garde sound. Talked about urban life, drug addiction, sexuality. Their music was raw, uncompromising, and it influenced punk and alternative rock in a big way.
It's incredible how music that might have seemed shocking back then can become so influential later on. It shows how art can change how we see the world.
The 60s were all about experimenting and pushing boundaries. Inspiring to see how those ideas still influence music today.
It's been an amazing journey, exploring the roots of rock and roll and seeing it become this global thing in the 60s. We've covered so much from those early blues influences to the British invasion, psychedelic rock, Motown folk rock, and so much more.
And the cool thing is rock and roll keeps evolving. It's a living art form that reflects who we are and where we're going.
Our deep dive into roots and revolution has shown us that rock and roll is full of surprises, hidden gems, and stories waiting to be discovered.
There's always something new to find.
So if you're feeling inspired, go explore the world of rock and roll.
Yeah, do it.
There's always a new artist, a new song that will speak to you.
And remember, rock and roll is more than just music. It's a reflection of us. So keep listening, keep exploring, and keep rocking.
All right, that's it for our deep dive into rock and roll. But hey, the music never stops. So keep those ears open, keep those minds curious, and we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.